capitalism and socialism. What truly works and what does not. This is one of the most persistent debates, and one of the loudest in modern history. An intellectual confrontation that has lasted longer than revolutions, brought down empires, shaken superpowers, and split the world in half for decades. For more than a century, capitalism and socialism were no longer just economic theories on paper, but became fiercely opposing front lines. Behind every patriotic speech, every workers' uprising, every economic downturn, or every war, fought by proxy between powers, the debate between these two systems quietly shaped the world we live in today. But there is one truth that supporters of any ideology rarely admit. No system has ever worked exactly as promised in books, not anywhere and not ever. And whenever war, famine, inflation, or collapse struck, the shiny theoretical layer vanished, revealing the raw and brutal reality beneath it. This story actually began long before humans even knew concepts like capitalism or socialism. For most of human history, what we now call the economy barely existed at all in any real sense. Every activity, every decision, and every human effort revolved around a single goal: survival. Kings believed they ruled by divine right. Landlords owned nearly all the land, and peasants worked tirelessly just to avoid starvation. Social progress moved so slowly it was like a drifting iceberg barely shifting at all. For thousands of years, human life operated like a zero-sum game, in which one person's gain always meant someone else's loss. If one rose, another was pushed down. Wealth came mostly from land, labor, and warfare, and productivity barely increased. Hardly any meaningful progress. At that time, believing that an ordinary person could become wealthy through trade or invention was considered pure fantasy. But then the Industrial Revolution arrived and overturned every old norm, opening an entirely new world. By the late 1700s, Britain was like a pressure cooker, packed with coal, iron, capital, and explosive ambition. Machines began replacing manual labor. Factories rose everywhere, replacing small workshops. And from this transformation, a completely new kind of power emerged, the power of private capital. For the first time in history, ordinary people could invest, take risks, and own assets at a scale previously imaginable only to kings. Productivity soared. A portion of the population grew wealthier. But alongside it, the lives of many others became harder than ever. And inequality rose at a rate never seen before in any prior society. Cities were covered in thick smoke, so dense that people felt they could barely breathe. Children worked 12 hours a day, exhausted in cramped factories, and slums turned into nests of disease, where illness spread uncontrollably. Yet no matter how brutal or ugly it was, one truth remained undeniable. Capitalism produced more goods, more wealth, and a pace of development that surpassed any era before it. And it was within this contradiction-filled context that socialism emerged, not as a beautiful or idealized dream, but as a desperate reaction to the harshness of industrial capitalism. By the mid-19th century, thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels looked at the bleak factory smokestacks, the workers' uprisings, and the shop floors stained with sweat and blood. And from all those seen, they reached an inevitable conclusion. The root of the problem lay within the system itself. In their eyes, the wealth of the capitalists was essentially value, taken away from the labor of the workers, a process of extraction disguised as opportunity. They argued that if workers jointly owned the factories, if profits were shared fairly, if production was directed toward human needs instead of private interests, then society would finally achieve true justice. No more exploitation, no more cycles of boom and bust, but rather a rationally planned system, where human dignity is placed equally. It sounded neat, noble, and deeply moral. And to millions being crushed beneath the gears of early-stage capitalism, it sounded exactly like justice. However, theory is just theory. Reality is a completely different story. For the first time, the world truly attempted socialism, on a national scale, not in a classroom, but amid the ashes of a fallen empire. After the 1917 revolution, Lenin inherited a country ravaged by famine, its people largely illiterate and backward. The Tsar had been overthrown. The old elite had either fled or been executed. And suddenly, a vast territory, with 150 million people, needed an entirely new system. Thus, the Soviet government began building that system. The state took ownership of land, factories, banks, and resources. Prices were set by bureaucrats. Production quotas were assigned, replacing the drive for profit. Nearly all forms of private business were eliminated. In theory, this system was supposed to create absolute equality and maximum efficiency. But in practice, it brought chaos. Without market prices, planners had no idea what people needed or how much. With no competition, factories had no reason to innovate or improve. With no personal incentives, workers had no reason to exceed the bare minimum. Shortages became a daily occurrence. Long queues became part of the culture. And agriculture, the backbone of Russia's economy, collapsed, leading to severe famine. Eventually, Lenin was forced to retreat, allowing a small amount of private trade, just to keep the nation alive. Yet something strange happened, despite clear failure. Socialism remained appealing. Because at that time, capitalism didn't look much better. In the early 20th century, capitalism created enormous growth, but also extreme instability. Speculation ran wild, corporations swallowed entire industries, and the rich lived like modern royalty, while millions struggled daily to survive. The system was excellent at creating wealth, but terrible at distributing it. That imbalance exploded in 1989, when the U.S. stock market crashed, marking the most catastrophic failure of capitalism. The Great Depression was no ordinary downturn. It was like a heart attack to the global economy. Banks collapsed en masse. Unemployment soared to 25%. Many nations saw their financial systems nearly annihilated. And to millions watching, capitalism didn't just have problems, it looked close to death. So by the 1930s, the world was forced to face a difficult truth to accept. No system operated the way it once promised. Socialism spoke of equality, but led to scarcity. Capitalism promised prosperity, but caused collapse. And then came a moment that changed everything. World War II. The war forced every major economy on Earth to put its system to the test under the highest pressure imaginable. The Soviet Union, despite countless inefficiencies, still mobilized its entire population with terrifying discipline. Centralized control allowed the state to pour all resources into the nation's survival, its very existence. Meanwhile, capitalist nations like the United States transformed themselves into massive industrial machines, showing the power of private innovation when combined with national-level coordination. When the war ended, the scoreboard comparing nations was no longer based on ideology but on GDP, infrastructure, growth rates, and living standards. From 1945 to 1991, the entire world became a gigantic laboratory. On one side stood the Soviet bloc with its centralized planning model. The state controlled almost everything, and markets were suppressed. On the other side were the US and its allies, running a regulated form of capitalism. Private businesses thrived, but with safety nets in place, built from lessons of the Great Depression. This was the real experiment. Not in manifestos, nor in grand speeches, but in the lives of millions who bore the consequences. And the results were both shocking and painful. In the Soviet Union, the early decades brought rapid industrialization, a dramatic drop in illiteracy, expanded housing, and significantly rising military power. But beneath the surface, cracks in the system began to appear. Without price signals to guide production, the economy drifted into inefficiency to absurd levels. Factories focused only on meeting quotas, producing goods no one could use, while farms produced harvests that rotted away. Innovation nearly ground to a halt. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had fallen decades behind in consumer technology. A nation that could launch rockets into space could not build a decent refrigerator. Meanwhile, capitalism continued to adapt and evolve. After the Great Depression, governments introduced a series of measures, such as market regulations, deposit insurance, antitrust laws, social security, public healthcare systems, and unemployment benefits. Capitalism did not become fairer, but it became survivable. It learned from its own failures. And adaptability became the system's ultimate weapon. By the 1980s, the gap between the two models was undeniable. Living standards in the West soared, while the Soviet economy stagnated. The Cold War wasn't decided by ideology, but by practical outcomes. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1918, the debate was effectively settled. The Soviet Union wasn't defeated by bombs or invasions. It fell because of empty shelves, because its incentives had rotted away, and because its economy could no longer function. A system built to eliminate inequality ultimately produced a new elite, a class of party leaders, officials, and insiders, while ordinary people had to wait in long lines just to buy bread. A system once expected to rise above market chaos collapsed under the weight of its own rigid planning, bureaucracy. And when the numbers were released, they revealed an undeniable truth. Western economies were simply more efficient, more innovative, and more flexible. But capitalism's victory didn't last long. Because even after the Cold War ended, its internal contradictions remained. By the 1990s and 2000s, capitalism transformed once again into something even 19th century economists could never have imagined. Finance exploded. Global supply chains stretched across continents, and credit flowed like water. Inequality surged again, this time on a scale reminiscent of America's Gilded Age. Corporations rose into powerful transnational forces. Entire economies began relying on debt, speculation, and asset bubbles. Then came the 2008 financial crisis, hitting with a strangely familiar feeling, a reminder that capitalism's instability never truly vanished. It only returned in a new form. Meanwhile, socialism resurfaced, not in the form of the old Soviet model, but as a softer, more nostalgic version, with calls for taxing the rich, national health care, free education, strong unions, and narrowing the wealth gap, appearing in many nations. Young generations, burdened by housing costs and stagnant wages, started to question whether capitalism still worked for anyone other than the wealthy. The debate was revived, but this time with an entirely new tone. Now almost no one wants a purely capitalist or purely socialist system anymore, because history has made the painful trade-offs of both crystal clear. Look at modern Scandinavia, often mistakenly labeled socialist. These countries have free markets, private businesses and global corporations, but they also impose high taxes, strong social welfare systems, and powerful unions. It's a form of capitalism with guardrails. A mixed economy, designed to reduce inequality while keeping innovation alive. Now look at the United States, a capitalist powerhouse with unmatched creativity, deep financial markets, and enormous global influence. But alongside that lies massive inequality, crumbling infrastructure, unaffordable healthcare, and a shrinking middle class. Then look at China, perhaps the most fascinating case. This is the world's biggest authoritarian capitalist economy. Beijing calls its model socialism with Chinese characteristics, but in reality, it resembles a form of state-guided capitalism, where private firms drive growth, while the government controls strategic sectors and markets, which are allowed to function only when aligned with national priorities. Yet even China faces the same contradictions, from debt-driven growth and property bubbles to an aging population and slowing productivity. When looking at the big picture, the truth becomes almost shockingly simple. Every major economy today is a hybrid model, combining markets with state power, between incentives and safeguards, between freedom and control. Not because ideologies fail, but because reality forces people to compromise. When these systems collide with the true nature of humans, such as ambition, greed, fear, laziness, or creativity, no theory can run smoothly. And that is the hard lesson to accept. Economic systems do not shape people as much as people shape economic systems. Human nature does not disappear in socialism or in capitalism. It simply reveals itself in different ways. In pure capitalism, greed can become a creative force until it turns into exploitation. And in pure socialism, equality can foster solidarity until it becomes oppression. In a market economy, power concentrates around wealth. In a planned economy, power concentrates in the political apparatus. Different systems, but people still share the same tendencies. Despite different propaganda, their flaws remain the same. Therefore, the real question is not which system is better, but which system has the most effective mechanisms to restrain power, to correct mistakes when needed, to reward beneficial behavior. And history has made one thing very clear. The system that adapts is the system that prevails. Capitalism survives because of its ability to reinvent itself. From eras of deregulation to the New Deal, to globalized finance and the age of technology. Meanwhile, socialism collapsed, where it refused to change, like the Soviet Union, Maoist China, or North Korea. But socialism thrived, where it embraced the market, such as Scandinavia. China after 1908, still authoritarian in parts of Western Europe. Vietnam is another compelling example. Since the Doi Moi reforms of 1986, Vietnam has combined socialist governance with market reforms, achieving high growth rates, a surge in exports, and becoming one of the fastest poverty-reducing countries in the world. It is not ideology that determines the winner, but adaptability. And to understand that, you don't need a PhD in economics. You only need to see where each system places its priorities. Capitalism focuses on incentives when it works well. It sparks creativity, calculated risk-taking, and productivity, because people are willing to build, to innovate, and to experiment when they are properly rewarded. But its downside is inequality, instability, and those economic cycles that push the vulnerable to the edge. Socialism puts its focus on equality. When it works well, it reduces poverty, expands access to essential services, and ensures basic dignity for everyone. But without incentives, productivity stagnates. Without markets, information becomes distorted. And without transparent institutions, corruption quietly spreads. Both systems have strengths, and both have their own failures, and both carry deep historical scar. The modern world you and I live in was built upon those very scar. Every safety net, every regulation, every market rule, every welfare program, and even each financial instrument all carry the mark of this century-long struggle that has stretched across generations. The mixed economies we have today are not proof that one system is won. They are proof that no system can survive on its own. But here's the turning point many people miss. The debate is once again shifting. Because the challenges of the 21st century, like AI disruption, population decline, climate risks, energy transitions, or global debt burdens, do not care about ideologies. They expose the weaknesses of both models. capitalism, and market struggle with long-term planning and maintaining social cohesion, while socialist-style planned economies struggle with flexibility and innovation. And the countries that will thrive in the next century will be those that combine most effectively the two forces, the creativity of markets and the endurance of public investment. Private sector innovation guided by public sector direction. Freedom paired with stability. If the last century taught us anything, it's that no system works well without guardrails, and no economy can survive without incentives, and no society can thrive when wealth or power becomes too concentrated, whether in the hands of billionaires or in the hands of bureaucracy. History never chose capitalism or socialism. History chose whatever prevented collapse. And every generation must reset that balance. Because the real debate was never capitalism versus socialism. The core issue has always been who holds the levers of power inside each system, from state capital, banks, unions, corporations, political parties, to regulators. The true battle has always revolved around one thing: power. And as history has shown again and again, power never disappears. It simply shifts from one hand to another. History shows no economic system is final. Each generation must rebuild, adjust, and rethink the balance between market and state. And as new technologies emerge, new risks form, and new power structures rise, the societies that thrive will be the ones willing to adapt faster than the challenges they face. If this knowledge helped you see the world a bit more clearly, don't stop here. Hit like so this content can reach more people. Hit share so others can also understand what's happening around them. And don't forget to subscribe, because who knows? The next perspective might change the way you see the world entirely.